one of the things, I just introduced some legislation dealing with gaps in radar coverage for the weather. Back in February, we had tornadoes that hit through Louisiana, a number of tornadoes. There were 2 deaths and multiple injuries. And it came to my attention that a large swath of southeast Louisiana, centered around Baton Rouge, the capital city of the state, does not have adequate Doppler radar coverage. And then just recently with this storm that came through, we had an undetected tornado here in St. Mary Parish. And so I've introduced legislation that would have the Secretary of Commerce ensure that there's adequate Doppler radar facilities in each of the state capitals, or at least encompassing the area of each of the state capitals within a 55-mile radius, because the risk of not having early warning is pretty high, and with a lot of population focused in our state capitals across the country, we think it's important to have this kind of adequate coverage, and certainly we have a gap here in Louisiana.
Yeah, they told me that I think it was around January when there were some tornadoes around.
Mm-hmm.
There was one that touched down over by Baldwin.
Yeah.
And they said that the Weather Service said that we were
Mm-hmm.
in between Slidell and Lake Charles's radar coverage, and it
There's
reaches
a big
here,
gap, yeah.
but it only reaches down to 10,000 feet or something,
Mm-hmm.
and that the tornado activity tends to happen
Yeah.
on the ground. So.
Yeah. Well, and we had problems centered around the Baton Rouge area, and the entire Baton Rouge area is vulnerable.
Yeah.
But it includes St. Mary Parish as well. So we have significant gaps, and being a state that is afflicted with lots of different weather events, we need to make sure that we have good coverage to pick up tornadoes early in this state to save life and hopefully prepare property.
Okay. And that's, you said, to require the Secretary of the Interior to make sure that,
Commerce, yeah.
Secretary of Commerce
Yeah.
to make sure that there's adequate coverage in the state capital.
Because they have under Commerce, you have the NOAA, National
That's
Oceanic
Weather Service,
Atmospheric Administration, and all the different entities, National Weather Service, all that works under Commerce.
Any read on how that legislation is going to go over?
Well, we just introduced it, and I think it should resonate with a lot of people, and I think we're gauging interest on the part of senators. So we just introduced the legislation. It took us a while to finalize the language, and I just dropped it last week. So, but this is something that I just became aware of. I didn't know prior to this, prior to the February events, that we did not have this kind of coverage.
Yeah.
And I've been very actively engaged, really since the very early days of my time in Congress, with hurricane protection. And suddenly when we're seeing more tornadoes and damage and lives that were lost, it's important to have early warning.
Yeah. Anything else in Washington going on that's going to affect?
Let's see, I'm trying to think. Last week, I authored a bill that would invoke the Congressional Review Act, dealing with these new regulations affecting our financial services area, and the Department of Labor issued this new rule called the fiduciary rule, which creates this whole new definition with responsibilities for financial advisors. And so, for instance, if you go in to buy a mutual fund, there are whole new sets of requirements now, which may add significant cost for the average investor. And we don't think this actually improves access to investment into mutual funds and certain types of financial or investments for middle class folks. It's going to add a lot of paperwork and additional cost, which could make some of the IRAs cost prohibitive for a lot of folks. We think this rule's gone too far. This is something that should be handled by the the SEC, the Securities Exchange Commission, rather than the Department of Labor. So what we have done is the legislation which passed in the House last week, I was a co-author of it, invokes the Congressional Review Act, which requires, if this passes through House and through Senate, House and Senate both, it requires that that Congress sign off after a complete review of this rule before it could be implemented. And we're saying, we're hoping the Senate will act on this as well. And there is support in the Senate. And there is bipartisan support for this.
Yeah, I got to tell you, after Madoff and that whatever it was in River Ranch, the Stanford's was
Stanford deal. Yeah.
And the financial meltdown generally in 2008, the federal government taking a bigger role in kicking some butt there doesn't sound so bad, to tell you the truth. But you're thinking this is going overboard? Yeah,
what they have done is gone overboard because what it's going to do is it deals with the fiduciary responsibility for the person. Now, talking to most financial advisors, they take their fiduciary responsibility pretty seriously. But right now, if you can go in and pay, this also pertains to the way you pay for financial investments, and if under the new rule, it will make investing much more cost prohibitive for the average investor who wants to buy a mutual fund, and that's a big part of the problem.
Yeah. A fiduciary refers to the duty that an advisor has to deal honestly.
To point out how ridiculous the rule is, we had a Webster's dictionary on the House floor, which is about that thick. Yeah. And the rule defining the word fiduciary was like this. I mean, it's very convoluted. And in talking to a lot of people in the financial services sector, and I'm not talking about the sophisticated Wall Street guys, but the guys who help with IRAs here locally, they're saying this is going to be very maddening and very difficult to deal with, and plus it's going to be very cost prohibitive for the average guy on the street who wants to put money into an IRA. It's going to be very much more costly in terms of fees. And so I think it goes overboard.
One thing I know that's been going on recently that has a Louisiana impact, potentially anyway, is the rapprochement with Cuba. You've got rice farmers that you represent who probably think it's a fine thing, and then the sugarcane farmers here, I expect, are a little less sanguine about the prospect.
Yeah. Well, a lot of our agriculture sector is very open about wanting to reestablish agricultural ties with Cuba, rice and soybeans in particular. The sugar industry also worries about whether this would create unfair competition. And the way we look at this is our sugar program is somewhat unique because sugarcane production and sugar production in other countries is heavily subsidized. And we don't want. We have a very strict tariff rate quota for outside sugar coming into the U.S. And so, any opening would not infringe on that tariff rate quota. And I believe our sugar industry would be just fine with this because the program would not be impacted by it. But this would open up a new market for rice, and Cuba's more interested in accepting rice from the United States than exporting sugar into the United States.
Yeah. The first cruise ship unloaded today, I heard, in Havana, the first since Jimmy Carter days, I guess. Yeah,
one of the problems we have is the way these shipments right now are bound by a cash up front transaction. So let's say Louisiana rice mills want to ship to Cuba. There's got to be a cash transaction made up front by the purchaser in Cuba. And under most normal circumstances with international trade, these things can be done under terms of credit. And so we're thinking that as the relationship becomes more normalized, we can move to a credit-based transaction system, and this will make it easier to ship rice there.
Okay.
I think the other big issue affecting us right now is oil and the price of oil. The impact we're feeling here in Morgan City and Lafayette, Homa. These decisions being made in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, are affecting employment prospects in Homa, Morgan City, Rayne, Lafayette, and but compounding the problem because of the drop in commodity price is the war on oil and gas that's being pushed by the administration with these new rules. One of them is the Bessie well control rule, which it takes a one-size-fits-all approach to blowout preventers in the Gulf of Mexico. And what the rule is proposing technologically is not truly feasible because of this one-size-fits-all approach from, whether it's a big deep water sophisticated rig versus a smaller platform on the outer continental shelf, and it's going to add significant cost without. And in fact, according to a lot of technical experts, they're saying it may actually increase the risk rather than decreasing risk. But the cost, there's a huge discrepancy in the cost. I think the administration says that the cost to industry would be somewhere around, I think, $650 million. And I think we saw one estimate by a separate accounting firm and consultancy that suggested the cost is more like $95 billion to the industry. This would have the impact, I believe, of, in effect, creating a moratorium in the Gulf of Mexico. And so our delegation has been working with the Texas delegation to try to push back on this. We're trying to get the administration to back off of it. But
you have any luck with that?
we're in the midst of those conversations right now, and I'm hopeful that we will be able to push back on it. We don't think the administration consulted sufficiently with industry on this. I think it was an arbitrary approach based on the type of commentary that was submitted and the level of commentary they submitted, and they truly didn't pay attention to some of the real technical information that the industry was trying to provide. But the administration also came out in its budget proposal with a new $10.25 tax on every barrel of oil produced in the United States or imported into the United States. And that's a ridiculous policy, because what it would do is it would take our refineries, which are relatively profitable right now, and make them unprofitable and less competitive versus foreign refiners. And at a time when that's been one of the bright spots in the energy sector, this would have the impact of hurting the downstream side while the upstream side is suffering as well. And if you take all that investment we're seeing, for instance, over in Lake Charles and in Baton Rouge in new refineries, it would kill it if that kind of tax were imposed. So that's really an ill-founded proposal put forth by the administration. And I've got legislation to stop that tax, and we're pushing the House leadership to let it move forward to make a firm statement. But I can say this: the president's budget's not going to get anywhere, so I feel pretty confident that that tax will not see the light of day.
Is any budget going to get anywhere?
Don't know. Still ongoing discussion. And the appropriators are starting to work off of the number that was agreed upon last year. It's just a handful of people on the Republican side that are blocking movement on a budget, which has put everything on ice right now in the House. It's unfortunate, because this was something agreed to last year. And, even though, and we know the Senate is not going to go with a slightly lower number, which is what some of these guys want. So it's an exercise in futility. And if we don't pass a budget, what will happen is we end up with all the rules pertaining to the amount of money that can be allocated in these appropriations bills. That agreed upon number that caps it is out the window, and it opens the door for all kinds of mischievous amendments to expand spending.
Okay. Another thing going on with the impact here, I guess, is I-49.
Yeah, yeah.
As I understand it, they are hoping to kind of piecemeal this as
Mm-hmm.
federal money becomes available, essentially supplemented by state money, matched by federal or local money, and it seems to be kind of snagged on the connector in Lafayette. Huh?
Yeah. Well, there are projects going on I-49 between Lafayette and New Orleans. It's mostly, there are 4 segments to it. There's the segment over by New Orleans, over Marsh, which is going to be expensive, and then the connector, which is expensive. And then you have the 2 segments in between, which affect this area. And projects are underway there, and you're going to start to see that escalate because we did pass a 5-year highway bill last year, and that is providing new revenue sources for the state. I know the governor has recognized this as a priority, as has the State Department of Transportation. I've met with Sean Wilson several times about it, and they're looking to escalate those activities. With regard to the connector, there are multiple options being looked at within the current plan on some of the design through Lafayette, and they're holding a number of public forums right now to kind of vet these through to get public buy-in on it. And it's a very open process. They walked me through how the process was going to work. I'm pleased with it. I think it's the most open process I've seen, where they're bringing all the stakeholders in. They're showing good graphics of what each option would look like, trying to minimize the impact on the area that this is going to traverse in Lafayette. And so they're working through that now. Now, the connector will likely be one of the later things that will be done, but we are seeing activity right now in those 2 middle segments, which will affect St. Mary Parish, Iberia Parish. We should see some good activity there over the next few years.
I was at your announcement event in December.
Yeah.
And you talked very, disparagingly about the president's leadership in general, but I was thinking more in terms of the Middle East. I know they're putting some more troops back in. It's a very small number, like 250, and they're
these are special operations.
very limited role. What should the president be doing in terms of ISIS in particular?
Yeah. Well, you have ISIS. You have the broader conflict in Syria, Iraq, that spilled over into Iraq. You've got major problems with a failed state in Libya. There's no broad strategy for what's happening across the Middle East. And that strategy is not only a military strategy in how we assist coalition partners. It involves building a strong coalition, which we don't have. That coalition's really more on paper than actually substantive in terms of what it's doing. So you have to build a strong coalition. You have to have clear objectives of what you're trying to achieve in each of those areas. And then it's not just a military component. You have to have an economic and diplomatic strategy, and a strategy to build out functioning governments in those areas. That's what's missing. And I see the same thing, the same problems we had in the immediate aftermath of Iraq and Afghanistan, where we were very good at going in with a military solution to a military problem, but we didn't have all the follow through, and that's what's missing. And I would like whoever the next president is going to have to take on this very complex challenge. But I think the other problem is broadly. American leadership is not respected anymore in that region. Even our European allies doubt our resolve. Of course, China and Russia are testing our resolve on a constant basis, and we need to reverse that negative trend, and that means setting forth clear objectives and making very clear what our intent is when necessary. I think the fact that the Russians are now buzzing some of our ships out in the Black Sea is a problem. We need to be quite clear with them. What needs that's got to stop. That's violating international norms, and it's dangerous. So I think this administration has allowed our military to suffer from multiple deployments and inadequate resources. And our intelligence community has lower morale, and we've lost a lot of experienced people there because of what's happened. Those two components need to be rebuilt, and our diplomatic corps is undersourced, and they're giving away American interests rather than really, going out and defending American interest and promoting American interest. And we've got to quickly change that, all of those things, because that puts, I think, the world in a much more dangerous posture.
Is there anything in particular you were thinking about when you're saying giving away American interest?
The Iranian agreement was a terribly one-sided agreement. I was after I read it, I was deeply disappointed about what transpired there. The Iranians are continuing to experiment with ballistic missile technology, and the capacity to put nuclear warheads on these missiles. They are continuing to advance cyber measures against U.S. interest, and it's getting worse. They're becoming one of the more sophisticated players. They're catching up with the Chinese and Russians on this. And they're using these tools, and they're using asymmetric warfare in the Middle East and beyond with Hezbollah and other proxy groups. And so we don't have the kind of response we need to these things. The sanctions regime was working reasonably well prior to the nuclear agreement with Iran, and now that sanctions regime is unraveled, and we're going to have to rebuild tools to deal with these other Iranian threats.
Are there circumstances where you would vote to put large numbers of troops back into the Middle East to deal solely with ISIS? Although Syria gets mixed in there till it makes your head hurt.
I don't think we need large numbers of troops on the ground in Syria. I think that would be a target. We don't even have a clear objective in Syria right now. We need to get that first. I think there's a role for special operations and intelligence. But I think most of what's going to have to happen in Syria is going to have to be done through coalition partners. And that's where the problem has been. This administration has not done a very good job of building a coalition with Turkey, with Saudi Arabia, the other Gulf states that have a significant stake in this. And there are assets that each of those countries could bring to bear with Arab boots on the ground that would, I believe, is what's necessary. Ultimately, that's the way you solve that problem. And I think what's happened is the Assad regime, coupled with Russia and Hezbollah and and other Iranian-backed groups, as well as the Iranians, have dominated on one side of this, and you have ISIS and some of the Al-Qaeda groups that have dominated on the other side and squeezed out the more moderate factions. And the administration allowed this to fester and made this situation much more complex than it was a few years ago. It would have been much easier to deal with it back then.